I found him shivering behind my dumpster on the worst night of my life. They said I was crazy for bringing a stranger into my home. But that one decision, made out of pure desperation and kindness, would change everything. Though not in the way anyone expected. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button if you believe in kindness, and subscribe because you won't believe where this goes. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end. Let me take you back to that night. It was February 14th. Which sounds romantic until you realize I was spending Valentine's Day working a double shift at County General Hospital while my 7-year-old daughter Sophie was at home with a babysitter I could barely afford. I'm a night shift nurse, and at 34 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of struggle there was. But that particular winter had broken me in ways I never imagined possible. 3 months earlier, Sophie had been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. The name doesn't matter. What mattered was the number at the bottom of every medical bill, $47,000. That's what her treatment was going to cost. And our insurance had denied the coverage, calling it experimental. I had applied for 3 loans and been rejected every single time. The eviction notice taped to my door gave me 30 days. We were on day 23. That morning started with Sophie's teacher calling me at 6 a.m. My daughter had fainted during breakfast time at school. She needed her medication adjusted immediately, which meant a new prescription that would cost $3,000 out of pocket. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, still in yesterday's scrubs, because I hadn't had the energy to change, and just staring at the wall. I didn't cry. I was too tired to cry. The afternoon brought more bad news when the bank called with their final rejection. The loan officer's voice was professional but cold. "We're sorry, but given your debt-to-income ratio, we simply cannot approve your application." I wanted to scream that my daughter was dying, that numbers on a spreadsheet didn't account for a child's life. But instead, I just said thank you and hung up. My shift that night was chaos. My only friend at work, the head nurse, who had always covered for me when I needed to leave early for Sophie's appointments, had quit that morning. She'd found a better-paying job across town, and I was genuinely happy for her. But it meant I was alone on the busiest night we'd had in months. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, I was running on fumes, coffee, and the desperate hope that tomorrow might somehow be better than today. I remember walking to my car in the hospital parking lot, and that's when I finally let myself break. I sat behind the wheel in the freezing cold because I couldn't afford to waste gas running the heater, and I cried. I cried for Sophie, for the life I couldn't give her, for every door that had been slammed in my face. I cried because I was so tired of being strong. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and half-formed prayers. When I pulled into the parking lot behind my apartment building, the rain was coming down in sheets. That cold February rain that cuts right through you. I was gathering my things from the passenger seat when I heard it. A sound somewhere between a groan and a whimper coming from behind the dumpsters. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had enough problems without getting involved in whatever drama was happening in the alley. But I'm a nurse, and some instincts you just can't turn off. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked toward the sound. That's when I found him. A man, maybe in his early 50s, curled up behind the dumpster in a pool of dirty water. He was wearing clothes that might have been nice once, but were now torn and soaked through. His whole body was shaking. And even from a few feet away, I could see the fever flush on his face. He was mumbling something I couldn't understand, completely delirious. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to call 911 and walk away. I didn't know this man. He could be dangerous. I had a daughter upstairs who depended on me. I had enough problems without adding a stranger to the mix. But then he opened his eyes for just a second, and I saw something there that I recognized. The look of someone who had given up completely. I knelt down beside him and checked his pulse. Racing. His skin was burning up. This man wasn't going to make it through the night out here, and the ambulance would take too long, even if I called. I made a decision that everyone would later tell me was stupid, reckless, and dangerous. I decided to bring him inside. "Can you stand?" I asked him. He mumbled something that might have been yes. With my arm around him, supporting most of his weight, we made it to the building's entrance. Of course, Mrs. Patterson from 2B was checking her mailbox at 11:30 at night because the universe has a sense of humor. She took one look at us and her eyes went wide. "What on earth are you doing?" she hissed at me. "He needs help," I said simply, too tired to explain further. "You're bringing a homeless man into this building. Into your home? With your daughter there." Her voice was sharp with judgment. "I'm bringing a human being who's about to die from exposure into somewhere warm," I replied, already moving past her toward the stairs. Getting him up 3 flights of stairs was one of the hardest things I've ever done physically. He kept trying to help, kept trying to climb, but his legs would barely hold him. By the time we reached my door, we were both exhausted. I fumbled with my keys, praying that Sophie was still asleep. She wasn't. My little girl was standing in the hallway in her pajamas, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Mommy, what's happening? Who is that?" "Honey, this man is very sick, and I need to help him. Can you go back to your room for a little while?" I tried to keep my voice calm and steady, but Sophie, bless her heart, stepped closer instead. "Is he going to be okay?" "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he is," I told her. I got him to the couch and immediately went into nurse mode. I took his temperature, 103.6. I cleaned the dirt and grime from his face and hands with warm water, checking for injuries. No wounds, just exposure and fever. I grabbed some of my late father's old clothes from the back of my closet, things I'd kept for sentimental reasons but never wore. They were too big for him, but they were dry and warm. I made soup, the cheap canned kind that was all I had, and managed to get him to eat a few spoonfuls. I gave him fever medication and covered him with every blanket I owned. Sophie sat in the corner of the room, watching everything with those big, serious eyes that children get when they're trying to understand grown-up problems. Around 3 in the morning, his fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, really opened them, clear and aware for the first time. They were blue, I noticed, a striking shade of blue that seemed out of place in his weathered face. He looked around my tiny apartment, taking in the cracked ceiling, the second-hand furniture, Sophie asleep in the armchair, and then at me. "You didn't have to do this," he whispered, and there were tears in his eyes. "Yes, I did," I replied. "We all need help sometimes." He told me his name was Daniel, just Daniel. When I asked if there was anyone I should call, any family who might be worried, he just shook his head. When I asked how long he'd been on the streets, he changed the subject, but I noticed something strange. His hands, despite all the dirt, they weren't calloused or roughened, like someone who'd been living rough for years. His speech, too, was refined, educated. This man had a story he wasn't telling me. The next morning, I had to leave for another shift. I was terrified of what I'd come home to. Would he be gone? Would my things be stolen? Would something worse have happened? But I also couldn't afford to miss work. Before I left, Daniel stopped me at the door. "Let me help you," he said. "I can fix things, do chores. I can watch your daughter after school if you need. Please, let me repay you somehow." I should have said no. Every safety guideline, every warning we tell our children about strangers, everything said this was wrong. But I looked at Sophie, who needed supervision I couldn't afford, and at our broken heater that I didn't have money to fix, and at this man who seemed genuinely desperate to help. I made another decision that defied logic. "Okay," I said. "You can stay for a little while." That first week was strange. Daniel fixed our heater with tools borrowed from the building's super. He repaired the leaking sink in the bathroom. He helped Sophie with her homework, and I'd come home to find them laughing together over math problems. He told her stories about art and history, about faraway places and amazing things. He cooked simple meals with the basic ingredients I had, and he never once made me feel uncomfortable or unsafe. But the whispers started. Mrs. Patterson made sure everyone in the building knew about that homeless man living with me. My supervisor at the hospital pulled me aside with concerns about liability. Sophie's teacher called with worry about an unknown man in her life. Each time I defended Daniel, he'd been nothing but helpful, kind, and respectful. He was good with Sophie in a way that made me think he'd had children of his own once, though he never spoke about his past. Then came the night everything fell apart. A massive envelope arrived in the mail. Sophie's hospital bill, $47,000 in bold red numbers. Attached to it was the eviction notice, now marked final. 7 days. We had 7 days to come up with 3 months back rent, or we were out on the street. I tried to hold it together until Sophie was asleep. I really did. But around midnight, sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by bills I couldn't pay, I finally broke down completely. I sobbed into my hands, trying to stay quiet, feeling like the worst mother in the world because I couldn't save my own daughter. I didn't know Daniel was awake. I didn't know he was watching from the doorway of the living room. When I finally looked up, he was gone, and so were the bills. So were the documents with our information. I found a note on the table, written in surprisingly elegant handwriting. Trust me. Don't worry. D. Panic hit me like ice water. What had I done? I'd let a stranger into my home, given him access to everything, and now he'd disappeared with all our personal information. Mrs. Patterson's warnings echoed in my head. Was he going to steal our identity? Sell our information? I couldn't sleep. I paced the apartment until dawn, imagining every terrible possibility. Day 1 passed with no word. Day 2 brought more suspicious looks from neighbors. By day 3, which was eviction day, I was packing our belongings with tears streaming down my face. Sophie sat on her bed, hugging her stuffed rabbit, asking the question that broke my heart. Is Daniel coming back, Mommy? I don't know, baby, I whispered, because I couldn't lie to her. I had trusted someone, shown kindness to a stranger, and now we were losing everything. The guilt was crushing. What kind of mother was I? On day 4, there was a knock at the door. I opened it expecting the landlord with final papers. Instead, I found a man in an expensive tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase. He looked like he'd walked straight out of a corporate law firm. Are you the woman who's been caring for Mr. Daniel Westbrook? He asked professionally. I don't know anyone named Daniel Westbrook, I said, confused and frightened. I know a Daniel, but the man you know as Daniel. He interrupted gently. May I come in? I promise, this is good news. His name was Robert Chen, and he was an attorney. What he told me over the next hour defied everything I thought I knew about reality. Daniel wasn't homeless. Daniel wasn't nameless. Daniel was Daniel Westbrook, the billionaire owner of Westbrook Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest drug companies in the world. His company was worth $4.7 billion. 6 months earlier, Daniel's wife and teenage son had been killed in a car accident. The grief had destroyed him. He'd walked away from his company, his fortune, his entire life. He'd wanted to disappear, to stop existing. He'd ended up on the streets, genuinely believing he deserved nothing better, that he had nothing left to live for. The night I found him, he'd been ready to let go completely. But something about my kindness, about Sophie's innocent joy, despite our struggles, about seeing someone with almost nothing still choosing to help others, it had awakened something in him. It reminded him why he'd built his company in the first place, to help people, to save lives. He went back to reclaim his company, Robert explained. But he asked me to take care of a few things first. Sophie's treatment was covered, completely. Not just covered, she was enrolled in an experimental treatment program that Westbrook Pharmaceuticals had developed specifically for her condition. Our medical debt, all $47,000, was paid in full. The apartment building had been purchased by a shell corporation Daniel controlled, and our rent was forgiven indefinitely. Not just ours, Mrs. Patterson's too, and everyone else who'd been struggling. The entire building was being renovated. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't real. Things like this didn't happen to people like me. 2 days later, Daniel came back. He looked different, clean-cut, wearing a simple but clearly expensive suit. But his eyes were the same, those striking blue eyes, and now they held something they hadn't before: hope. "I'm sorry I left like that," he said, standing awkwardly in my doorway, like he wasn't sure he was welcome anymore. "But I had to fix things properly. I had to become myself again so I could actually help you." Sophie ran to him before I could say anything, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I knew you'd come back," she said simply. Over coffee, Daniel told me the full story: how he'd been lost in grief, how he'd given up, how that night in the rain behind the dumpster had been his lowest point, how I'd saved his life not just physically, but in every way that mattered. "You showed me humanity when I'd forgotten it existed," he said quietly. "You had every reason to walk past me, to protect yourself and your daughter, to focus on your own overwhelming problems, but you didn't. You saw another human being in need, and you helped. That's rare, that's precious." But Daniel didn't stop at just helping us. He'd established a foundation called Sophie's Hope, dedicated to helping single parents facing medical crises with their children. He wanted me to run it, not as charity, but as a real job with a real salary, using my nursing background and my lived experience to help others like us. "You understand what they're going through," he explained. "You know the fear, the desperation, the impossible choices. Who better to help them?" He'd also redirected much of his company's research toward rare diseases affecting children, conditions that big pharmaceutical companies often ignored because they weren't profitable enough. Money didn't matter to him anymore, he said. Impact did. Sophie's scholarship fund was established for her entire education, from now through college. But more than the money, Daniel had given us something else. He'd given us hope. He'd shown us that kindness wasn't weakness, that helping others when you have almost nothing isn't stupid, it's everything. That was 2 years ago. I'm still running Sophie's Hope Foundation, and we've helped over 2,000 families facing the same impossible situation I faced. Sophie is thriving, the treatment is working, and she's back to being a normal 9-year-old who loves art class and hates broccoli. Daniel is still in our lives, not as a benefactor, but as a friend, someone who stops by for dinner and still helps Sophie with her homework. Sometimes late at night, I think about that moment behind the dumpster. If I'd walked away, Daniel might have died there, but I also would have died in a different way, under the weight of debt, under the crushing guilt of not being able to save my daughter, under the slow erosion of hope. We saved each other that night. He just had more resources to show his gratitude. Mrs. Patterson, by the way, never apologized for her warnings, but she did bake us cookies when she found out her rent was forgiven. I consider that progress. The truth I've learned is this: you never know whose life you're changing when you choose kindness. You don't know if that person you help is a billionaire or just someone struggling like you. And it shouldn't matter. What matters is that we see each other, really see each other, and choose compassion over convenience. I didn't rescue a homeless stranger that night. I rescued a man who'd lost himself. And in return, he made sure no one would ever face alone what I had faced. Sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. That's not karma, that's just humanity at its best. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove kindness always comes back around. And remember, you never know whose life you might change with one simple act of compassion. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.